Alright, hello everybody, welcome to our next lesson here. Today we're going to be talking about power and political gains. Specifically, we're going to be looking at power and political gains in the 1970s and the 1980s for African Americans. So our objectives and standards to identify political gains by African Americans in the 1970s and 1980s and understand how African Americans reacted to political changes and challenges, and take a moment there to look over the standards, please. And our desired result: how did African Americans make advances in politics and government? So the growth of politics. During the early 1970s, African Americans were elected to many government positions at the local and national levels. Others were appointed to positions of power, such as Thurgood Marshall. He's down here in the bottom right-hand corner for you there. To the Supreme Court, the first African American appointed to the Supreme Court, and Patricia Roberts Harris as U.S. Ambassador by President Lyndon B. Johnson. So there's Patricia Roberts Harris there, and then LBJ, President Lyndon B. Johnson, right up here in the top corner. The first African American elected to Congress since Reconstruction was Republican Edward William Brooke the third. He's right there in the top left-hand corner. Also, the first African American woman elected to Congress was Shirley Chisholm. I'll show you her picture on the next page. So again, others were appointed to positions of power. Also, 9 members of Congress in 1969 formed the Congressional Black Caucus to represent and unite African American members of Congress. Now, the group is still around today, and the group is open to anyone, but primarily has Democrats in it. So here's Shirley Chisholm here, first African American woman elected to Congress. A convention in Indiana. In 1972, several thousand politicians, social activists, and students held a rally in Gary, Indiana. Now, the goal of the convention was to address issues facing the African American community, so that was the goal. While there were some disagreements, members of the convention drafted a platform known as the National Black Political Agenda, and the agenda focused on healthcare, housing, and the economy. It also encouraged African Americans to seek political office. Soon following the convention, African Americans began to enter the political world in larger numbers, and some of the big speakers or big people involved in this convention were Jesse Jackson up here and Louis Farrakhan. I believe I'm saying this name correctly, right down there for you. So, leading in politics. During the 1970s and the 1980s, many African Americans played roles in politics. Many served in political offices from local to national levels. The first African American governor in Virginia was Douglas Wilder, who had served as a state senator prior to that. His picture's up to the top. Barbara Jordan served in the U.S. House of Representatives, and she played an important role in the congressional hearings on the impeachment of President Richard Nixon. Right down there for you. So the work of affirmative action. Other issues still remained for African Americans. In the 1940s, defense companies were prohibited from discriminating against job seekers under President Franklin D. Roosevelt. On the right-hand side here, his picture is there. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 also expanded this policy to all companies. In 1965, President Lyndon B. Johnson established the policy of affirmative action by issuing an order that companies increase minority employment. Again, President Lyndon B. Johnson's picture on the left-hand side there for you. This gave opportunities to women and minorities in school and jobs. So affirmative action expands. In 1967, affirmative action policies began to include women. Affirmative action requires companies to hire women and minorities. In education, schools are required to create programs and set spots aside. Affirmative action is still used and debated today. People who support the program say it is needed to advance job and educational opportunities for women and minorities. Those who oppose the program say it rewards people based on their race instead of their work, and there was a Supreme Court case that came before this about affirmative action. In 1978, the Supreme Court held, or 1978, the Supreme Court held the Bate case about set-aside programs and if they were unconstitutional or not. So changes during the conservative era. During the late 1970s, politics moved more towards conservative views. The 1980s saw a growth of conservative political leaders and policies, and Ronald Reagan, on the right-hand side here, was elected president in 1980, and a new conservative era began. The Reagan years saw a focus on restoring national prosperity and strength, so dealing with money and things like that, and policies focused on smaller government involvement and focused on moral values. Social liberal reforms and racial policies were limited. There were calls for an end to affirmative action, gun control, and huge government budgets, and there were dramatic cuts in food stamps, unemployment compensation, and student loans. So African Americans in the conservative era. There were many African Americans who felt conservative policies hurt social and economic programs. Economic recession in the 1980s led to unemployment, homelessness, and cuts in education and housing. In many cases, poor African Americans were hit hard by these policies, and soon African Americans were looking for a change in government. So Jesse Jackson, we've talked about him a lot. He was a leading liberal politician in the 1980s. He was a civil rights leader who turned his attention and focus towards politics. During the 1983 voter registration drive, Jackson helped elect Harold Washington, the first African-American mayor of Chicago, Illinois. Jesse Jackson also helped African Americans to register to vote. Jesse Jackson in late 1983, Jesse Jackson late 1983 announced he was running for president. He lost the nomination to be the Democratic nominee, but he did gain significant support as well. So the support of the Rainbow Coalition. To speak out against policies of the Republican administration, Jesse Jackson used the Rainbow Coalition to do so, and it brought together young people, minorities, and poor Americans. They called the group the Rainbow Coalition, and it aimed to unite unsatisfied voters to push for reform. In 1988, Jesse Jackson ran again for president and performed very well, perhaps better than he did in 1984. However, he fell short once again, but still made a major impact with the Rainbow Coalition. You can kind of see the political pin there in 1988 for Jesse Jackson. All right, so our closure. How did African Americans make advances in politics and government? Think about some of the positions they held and the work that they did. Think about how they tried to push for better reforms and things like that in the 1980s, and that'll help you answer your question. Hope you have a great rest of your day or night. Please try your best on the questions that follow, and I hope to see and talk to you all soon. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.